My grandmother, my mom's mom, was diagnosed with breast cancer in her 40s. She's from Dominican descent, and I lived with my grandmother until I was almost 8 years old. So when I finished high school and was 18, I decided to go back and spend a year with my aunts and my grandmother in the Dominican Republic. And that year I went back, her cancer returned to her other breast, and became metastatic. So that year that I lived there with them, we lived with the fear every weekend that my grandmother was going to die of breast cancer any moment now. She was receiving chemotherapy at home. My cousin was a physician, just finishing his residency, and he actually was the one who hung her chemo and would hung her other IV medications for her. My aunts were all women who never married, and they dedicated their lives to my grandmother. So there was always someone at home with her, bathing her, helping her get to the bathroom, helping her go through many other issues. And she was blind. She had had glaucoma. So the only thing she could see was like big packets or big bulk in front of her. So imagine living with the fear of the blindness for many years and now a new cancer diagnosis. But my grandmother left us something very wonderful. The day before she died, we all have very strong faith. We're of Catholic descent. She all of a sudden started looking up behind everybody that was around her. And she opened her eyes very wide and she said, "How beautiful." And she was looking at something totally beyond us. And she started mentioning people who had died. And she said, "There is so and so, and there's somebody else." And even one of her brothers who had died that year, but no one told her he had died because they didn't want her to be emotionally upset about it. She mentioned his name as well. And I remember when that happened that we all just, everybody got chills, and everybody was so, joyful at the same time that here it is, here's this woman who's on the verge of dying, and there is something beyond, there is something beautiful waiting for us beyond this place. This woman who was blind all of a sudden saw this place of beauty with all of her loved ones around her. So we went through, my grandmother's everything. We would help bathe her, we would help take care of her. I remember one day coming home from, my cousins and I lived in a town next over, because they were in college and I was helping with my uncle's store. And one weekend when we thought my grandmother was going to die, we came home and there was a coffin in the middle of the dining room, and we're like, what is this? We're not used to this here in the United States, but over there, when you die, they bury you that same day because there's no embalming. So it's something that's very quick. So they had a special coffin made for her, and they thought she was dying, and the coffin, was there waiting. So it's, you went through all these experiences where you're like, oh my Lord, is this really happening? And I just remember, the courage that my grandmother showed, that even though, through this horrible experience where she was in terrific pain from her bony metastases, and she was suffering, she always, when we came to see her and say hello when we were home during the weekends, she always asked, "How are you doing? What's going on in your life? What's different?" She tried, when she was able in the beginning, she would still join us for lunch. She would sit in the Dominican Republic. The big thing is your lunch meal. So everybody would be home from school, from work, and everybody would gather and sit around the table at 12 noon and eat the meal together. And when she was able, she continued to participate in that. She always, wanted to know what was going on in our lives, what was of interest. So she was a tremendously strong and courageous woman. And that was my first experience with breast cancer, and not just with breast cancer, but with the battle, that goes on with that disease, and the impact that it has on a family.